Is that enough to sustain their support to sort of overrun the Russians, and ultimately the deciding factor is the Russian economy? If they can come through with these occasional huge decisive blows, we've had 2 or 3 on the Ukrainian side at this point, then that can be the tipping point. My only question is, how far can this go? Can the durability of the Russian economy outlast the ingenuity and patience, or whatever willingness of the West or the Europeans to support Ukraine?
Well, the fact is that Russia is currently expending about 40% of its national budget on national security defense related issues, and it's more than it can afford to expend. I mean, it's a lot of money they're burning on that. But there's another thing, is that it's creating a lot of inflation within Russia. So it's something that I think runs a different risk for them. But let's look at a different issue totally, which is the fact that can Russia continue like this for long or forever? It certainly can't continue like this for long or forever. And once again, Vladimir Putin's objectives at the end of the day, much more than he even cares about Ukraine, is his own survivability.
This is the Global Gambit.
How are you going, everybody? It is, well, we're back to Ukraine, we're back to Russia. We've had Jake Braun, we've had Ben Hodges on, we've had many a familiar voice talking about recent developments, but someone who I was very interested to hear their take on, given that we haven't spoken for a couple of months. I think we spoke earlier in the year, is Jason Marr, who is chief correspondent at Kiev Post, and also now a profound YouTuber, someone who's been doing an incredible amount of coverage of Operation Spiderweb and the Kirk's events also. And, well, one of the things that I wanted to ask you very simply, Jason, is in the time that you and I were talking about having this conversation earlier today, is that Trump and Putin had a conversation. They apparently had a conversation where Putin essentially told Trump, we're going to have to respond to June 1st, to Spiderweb. We're going to have to respond. And Trump seems to be increasingly disenfranchised with Putin. He's not necessarily more supportive of Ukraine, but he's not willing to get in the way of Congress, who may well want to do things, and some other countries that may well want to up the support for Ukraine even further. So initially, given your context and what you've been spent time covering, how are you looking at the situation 3 days on, 4 days on? Are we expecting a big response from Russia? And if so, how would that look like?
Well, the reality is that Russia does not have the capacity to do much of a big response. It already targets civilian infrastructure and civilian buildings, so it'll probably continue to do that. But how would it do it more than it's done historically? It's very hard to imagine. The fact is, in the last series of drone strikes within Ukraine done by Russia, only 12.5% of the drones hit their intended targets. The rest got shot down or destroyed. In the case of the ballistic missiles and the missiles that are being used from North Korea, it's been a 0% success rate in the last couple of weeks. So everything that we can look at objectively would say that Russia simply does not have the capacity to have a serious attack within Ukraine. Now, we can look at the consequences, though, from the other side of this as well. What are the consequences for Russia? What have we seen since this attack? And I think one of the most important things that we've seen is that, one, Vladimir Putin disappeared for a number of days and just today reappeared. And why is that? Why is it important? Well, one, it shows great weakness. He did not confront the problem. He did not come out to the nation, explain what had occurred and what it meant. He didn't go to visit these bases that were attacked. What he did was he hid. And that's sort of profound. But it's also not the first time he's done that. When there was the Prigozhin roll towards Rostov, we saw the same thing. We've seen historically Putin runs away when there's a problem. And that's why a lot of people are saying internally, there's probably a lot of problems that he's trying to sort out. And one of those problems that you and I have discussed before is the fact that the tension between the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, and the Russian military is extremely high. Now, of course, Vladimir Putin is a career KGB guy, and he's much more attached to the intelligence service. In fact, he was the former director of the FSB before he became the prime minister in 1999. But still, he is somebody who is considered aligned with the intelligence services. Those intelligence services today, they're going after the military. They're saying we have to investigate how these huge failures for Spiderweb were possible. What went wrong? Was there perhaps even collusion on the side of some people in the Russian military? And the Russian military is fighting tooth and nail. It doesn't want to be investigated. And the reason is very simple. Is because if an investigation starts, it'll uncover just not who failed and why Spiderweb was successful. It'll also uncover corruption. It'll expose that there's entire probably brigades of troops or radar systems and other things that exist on paper, but in fact aren't guarding Russia. They don't exist at all. Because that money that was meant to go for national security has been embezzled by people within Russia's military leadership. And that's why I'd be curious what you think. How do you think that Russia's responded to this so far? And what do you make of the Kremlin's actions?
Well, it's a good question, Jason. And I think that, well, one point I really want to underscore from the beginning, and you took the words out of my mouth, which now makes me just sound like a parrot instead of someone really clever, which is that Putin runs away. He goes silent when challenges really are a systemic threat to him. We saw this with the Wagner mutiny in 2023, and we've seen it in moments of freedom over, say, over Kursk. He disappeared for a couple of days in late 2024 when the Ukrainians surprised the world with that offensive. And he disappeared after the events of Sunday. And it shows you that he is overwhelmed. He's not able to sort of put on a strong face, which him as the de facto strongman is what you would expect. And I agree that there is a lot of uncertainty within Russia. The inner circles are often, I think, bickering. Maybe infighting is a bit of a strong word at times. When things really escalate that much further, then it becomes infighting. And, you know, Putin's made these alterations to his power structure, his support base, if you like, moving Shoigu from the defense secretary or defense minister to the national security accounts, to these horizontal, these lateral shifts, bringing in others who are, you wouldn't expect, like Belousov, you wouldn't expect these individuals to be in the positions of defense, but he's an economics minister. But it shows you because he has to really put the wartime economy in a central footing. And clearly the ability for Spiderweb to really break through 4,000 kilometers into Russia illustrates that sort of what is one of the biggest assets that Russia has relied upon tacitly. It's its territory, it's its size. And clearly modern warfare, modern technology is illustrating, forget the Americans, this is Ukraine that has done this. And furthermore, without external support. They've in-house developed these drones with off-shelf bits of equipment and been able to strike at the heart of Russian military assets. So this is a huge, I think, embarrassment. It's a huge wake-up call for Russia's insecurities as well, even more than it was a couple of years ago. But thirdly, illustrates that sort of Ukraine's tenacity and ingenuity at leveraging sort of asymmetrical warfare. It's a bit of an overused term, but I think that's the point, right? And it's not just Russia. This goes to Iran, this goes to China, this goes to any countries that are watching and realizing that they don't necessarily need to invest in high-grade, expensive, complex military assets to get the job done. So, yeah, I think it's a pivotal moment here. But I reframe my point to you as a question, which is sort of how far will this really have an impact on Russia's overall operations? Because as far as I understand, their nuclear triad isn't affected. They still have other assets that they can fall back on. Ukraine is struggling on the manpower front. How far should we look at this?
Well, it's significant. I mean, it does actually, I think, going to lead up to larger changes that will affect the war because it's coupled with other things. As I said, historically, I've argued for over 3 years now that Ukraine will win, but it won't be because of a direct military victory in the sense that Ukraine will not just reach the 1991 borders. The Russians will say, you are right, we were wrong, we'll stay on our side of the border and no longer transgress. That's, I think, very unrealistic. What is much more realistic is that Russia is no longer able to continue fighting. I don't think there will ever be a change of heart for ideological purposes, but due to personal interest, I think there will be. And what do I mean by that specifically? I think that there's 3 different ways of working. And as I said, one is militarily, but the other 2 ways, one is economic and one is political. So if we look at the political side, what do I mean? I mean a situation like Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, who decided to try to roll towards Moscow. Now, why that event was so important, and I would argue it's truly of a historic nature of its importance, is because it showed us a lot of things. But the most important thing that it showed us was that, 1, Putin is not invincible. But second to that, it showed us the exact response of the Russian population. So, as you recall, Prigozhin heading up the way from Ukraine, he was not stopped by the Russian military. Now, they knew where he was 100 kilometers in advance, but they didn't call it an airstrike. The National Guard didn't stop him. The police didn't stop him. The local police did not stop him. The FSB did not stop him. The Chechens, who are supposed to be the ones to defend Putin specifically and his regime, guess what? They had to go 100-something kilometers, and over the course of 5 hours, they weren't able to make it. which shows you how dedicated they were to defending Putin's regime. And when Prigozhin got to Rostov, we see the videos of the citizens going to him, bringing him food, bringing his soldiers food and water and wine. And there's something else here. We saw Prigozhin in the videos that have come out, Prigozhin speaking to senior Russian military leadership in Rostov. And why that's so important? Because in the videos, they didn't say to him, we're going to arrest you, or we are now going to take you to Moscow, be prosecuted. They drank coffee with him. They sat on the street, drank coffee, smoked cigarettes, and said, listen, you really shouldn't be doing this. This really isn't a good idea. Perhaps you've done something you should not have done. But it was not a confrontation. And you think, so they didn't even confront him with words. They didn't lay hands on him. They did not call an airstrike on him. Why is that? And why is it during this whole time, Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, why is it that Medvedev, the former president, all these other people were silent? It's because nobody was sure if this was the end, if in fact the Putin regime would fall. And that's why you saw no reaction from anybody, the military or senior political leaders within Russia. And Putin himself, as usual, disappeared. So what this all means is something very important, which is that the Putin regime internally, it has the trappings of power. It has the diplomatic trappings of power where it can go around and have embassies, and it looks official. Putin's always in palaces in these photos. But the fact is, it's very, very weak. It's hollow. And there's a second factor, which that is the political side. We don't know if tomorrow these persecutions by the FSB against military leadership for the failures leading up to Operation Spider. Now, if you're a senior military leader and you know that the day they come to investigate you, they're going to find out that, guess what? You've been embezzling money for years. And guess what? Everyone else in your office has also been engaged in the embezzlement with you, signing off documents that you told them to sign off. You realize that the jig is up. Things could get very bad because you'll definitely be going to prison, if not even worse. So what would you do to stop that persecution? And that's why I think this conflict with the FSB is so important, because ultimately there's already conflict there. And the more that the military is at the throat of the intelligence service, the better. The chance of a revolt from people within the military cannot be ruled out. And it's happened in the recent past. So I think that's very important. But the other aspect is the economy. And overall, which we could dive to in just a second, I'd be curious what you think and how you analyze the situation.
Well, I think that in large part, I mean, on one hand, Putin is the pin-up strongman, right? He's the people that Orban, Fico, others have all wanted to try to resemble, right? Even Trump himself looks at what Putin has achieved in his 25 plus years of power and really sort of curated this unimaginable, unequivocal example of sort of centralization. But at the same time, it's not the CCP. This is a very sort of eclectic group of people who support Putin because he's put them in the positions. But at the same time, if they suddenly realize that they would be net beneficially off with someone else in power, then Putin suddenly becomes a little bit expendable. I think Putin has done a good job of navigating this, purging people at relevant times. But as you say, and as we have both seen with the mutiny by Wagner, or attempted mutiny, or whatever, however symbolic it was, there were clearly people within the military infrastructure, the military system, who were like, hey, we're not going to sort of endorse you, but neither are we going to stop you, kind of thing. So, and I think we've seen that happening with the operations in Africa, right? I just came back from Africa, and the amount of role that Wagner, or the, by extension, broader Russian government has had in different parts of the continent is very stark. And that sort of, it's that extended influence that Putin has been able to leverage, that has made him sort of been able to sustain his, I think, place. But at the same time, you know, to bring it back to the economy, and right now, there continue to be the ultranationalists, the hardcore groups, forget the systemic opposition of, well, whatever, the communists and the LDP and such. There are those who are fed up with Putin not doing enough. And, you know, I've spoken to guests and analysts who say that, we're really getting to the point where will Putin potentially have to use a tactical nuclear missile? I personally think, is Putin really going to be the first head of state that would actually want to do that? But I sort of pose that to you as a question. Is like, what could Putin do that would really feel like cements his position, gets pressure off his back, but still responds to the situation in Ukraine, but not enough that the United States or Trump is even more like out of his mind that he's nuts, right? What options does Putin have right now?
If Putin has sense, he understands that he doesn't have total control of the military, though the intelligence service he's much tighter with. And that's why I think that this could actually lead to a very interesting situation, which is that they will not prosecute a full examination as to what went wrong, specifically because he knows that could become destabilizing for his regime. Right. In which case, it means they would not improve the security as they should, because they're more interested in doing what is necessary to maintain power. Now, that's bad for Russia in the long term, good for Ukraine. At the same time, I think there's a different aspect of this, which is why he'll never use nuclear weapons. It's something I think it's totally unrealistic for a lot of reasons. But two reasons I would probably cite, first and second, would be, one, Russia doesn't spend the billions of dollars a year necessary to maintain its nuclear arsenal. And given that most, or if not all, of the nuclear arsenal is coming from the Soviet period, it becomes a very high risk that it won't work. And why that's important? Because let's imagine that tomorrow Putin decided he's going to nuke some city in Ukraine. So he tosses a nuke on that city. One, there's really no military objective that's gained with that. It's not like he's destroying something that's going to really change the war for his troops, where then they're going to have a decisive means of making gains. But second to that is that, let's imagine the weapon didn't work. Let's imagine that it just sort of bounced down the road. Now Putin is really in a bad situation. It's like pulling a gun in a fight. You now better pull the trigger, because if the other guy pulls a gun, he's definitely going to pull the trigger. You've now exposed yourself fully. And in his case, he'd be exposed on many sides. Now, his own psychology would be that, one, he's shown that he's impotent before the United States and NATO, but also, and I think more importantly, before China. China, which is why Russia would have nuclear weapons, especially tactical ones in the long term, would probably be China, because they have to be concerned about that relationship 20 years into the future. But if this today was showed that he doesn't have the capacity to actually use nuclear weapons reliably, that removes the ability to make credible threats. And credible threats, as you know, in nuclear security, is the essential thing. If you cannot make a credible threat, that is, you cannot be counted on to follow through with what you threaten to, your value is nothing. So I think that he would run a huge risk with that before both NATO and the Chinese. But there's another aspect of this, which is that the Chinese, it seems very clear, put pressure on Russia to not use nuclear weapons. And why that is so important is China is the largest trade partner for Russia. In fact, it's about 15% of Russian exports go to China. However, less than 2% of Chinese exports go to Russia. And if you look at China historically and as well in the recent past, it's much more interested in trade than it is in playing the games of Russia. And that's why we saw, for instance, when the United States announced 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, there was emergency meetings in Switzerland specifically to discuss that, because the Chinese knew it would be terribly damaging for their economy. And this brings me to the second point, which is the economy, another way this war can end. Currently, before the U.S. Senate, and immediately go to the House thereafter, is the bill that would be new sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil, gas, uranium, etc. Now, who buys Russian oil? In fact, I can tell you, it's India and China. Combined, more than 80% of Russian oil is sold to them. Russian oil, as you know, is about 38% of the Russian budget. Now, why would China and India stop buying this oil from Russia, which they get cheap? For a very simple reason. The new U.S. sanctions would put 500% tariffs on any goods coming from a country that's buying this Russian oil or gas. China simply cannot afford that. It does 10 to 15 times more trade with the United States than it does, and its allies, than it does with Russia. Likewise, India is in a similar situation. Less 1% of its trade is with Russia. It's simply not worth it. Yes, India did save about $26 billion buying Russian oil. But in the long term, trade with the United States, it's much more interesting. In fact, we've seen that in the past year, half a year, that India has been buying less Russian oil. So already they're moving that direction. In the case of China, we've seen that they're so worried of sanctions that a lot of banks now are not even accepting clients who have Slavic-sounding names out of fear that it might actually be a Russian. So we see that things are going that direction. Now, for Russia itself, this could be highly destabilizing, these new sanctions to the United States. Keep in mind, Russia's economic situation is a total disaster, despite what they say. The central bank has kept interest rates at about 21% since 2024. But more than that, interest rates for personal loans and mortgages, it's more than 30%. And just in the past couple of months, 7% of people that have credit cards have defaulted on them. That's a huge number. And it keeps growing. It can get closer to 10%. So overall, we see the domestic economy within Russia is struggling. And why that's important? Because ultimately, when your army runs out of money, that changes things. It makes the war a lot harder to fight. Because what's the motivation to stay? Or what's the motivation to join the military? Russia's economy is a disaster. And I can cite endless statistics about this, but there is a lot going on that we see. And we see the secondary evidence of this. The people that are not trusting the Russian banks as much as they did, the fact that Putin is feeling pressure to get rid of the Russian central bank, who's been, I gotta say, quite good at her job, unfortunately, because he says, no, we should give out more free money. But printing money is not going to make things better. That's going to make inflation worse. They've forced the ruble down by burning currency reserves. It's now about 80 to the dollar. But it's projected by most Russian economists that it'll probably get to probably 110, even 120 by the end of this year. Now imagine, if it's at 120, that means it's lost 50% of its value. It's devalued 50% in the course of a few months. How does a Russian worker survive on losing half their income? Keep in mind, in Moscow, the average worker spends about 3/4 of their income on rent. But imagine something different. Imagine you bought an apartment. Tons of Russians are underwater with their apartments. But now imagine something else happens. You have to pay that back in what was the dollar or euro equivalent. But if you've lost half the value, your income is totally worthless now. How will you ever get the money, now that the money's worth half of what it was, ever get enough money to pay back your mortgage? You'll never pay it back. And so people will just walk away on it. When they walk away on it, the banks already have serious problems with liquidity. In fact, the average Russian bank, according to the central bank, has only 9.5% of liquid assets. Standard in the West or normal countries is 20 to 30%. That 20% is the bottom. They have less than half of that. Already, the central bank is pumping liquidity into the banks to keep them stable. Russia's economy really could just go completely berserk, and it could happen very fast. And that's something that Putin has no plan for. But how do you see it?
Well, I commend you on a very extensive, I think, breakdown there, the intersectionality of great power competition as well as the economics of Russia internally. I mean, personally for me, I've been quite a big fan of Elvira Nabiullina, if I get her name correctly, right? She's the governor of the Bank of Russia. Some people think that she's tacitly not supportive of Putin, which is why she sort of tried to sustain the economy with the policies that she has, which would sort of go against what Putin's, policies have been. She's doing a pretty, I think, phenomenal job considering the whole broader situation. But to the whole broader situation, I mean, yes, one might have in the past said that, hang on a second, the Indians and the Chinese are propping up the Russian economy. The Indians particularly buy so much of their military equipment from the Russians, or did at least prior to 2022. The Chinese are so embedded down with the role that they provide, the installation of that drone factory in China that the Russians have been developing, right? These sorts of assets and methods by the Russians to sort of diversify away from their reliance on the West, or just to try to sort of counterbalance against the sanctions, which again, people will say, well, they don't work, and well, they're not a sort of quick fix. They're a long, slow burner process, right? And I certainly think that that's the case. And we can see that this comes to a head, right, Jason, when you've got the Chinese and the Russians arguing over that Siberian oil pipeline. And the Russians wanting X amount for it, and the Chinese being like, well, no, we're only willing to pay this amount. And it exposes the reality or the limitations of their relationship. So the Russians have this very limited set of options now. And from the Chinese perspective, I think it's really interesting to your point about that the Chinese are very pragmatic. They don't see this as more than a mutually beneficial arrangement, in the sense that when the Russians and the North Koreans signed their strategic partnership around about a year ago. I remember we had a conversation about this almost a year to the day after the agreement was signed. And we were both making the same point, which is that, yes, China doesn't like the West or whatever, but it benefits from the existing system, the prevailing order. And therefore, to have the Russians and the North Koreans disrupting that brings attention to the East, brings attention to China's backyard, which China doesn't really want, because they're busy trying to destabilize the South China Sea and focus on Taiwan and their skirmishes with the Philippines and so on. So absolutely, there is a dichotomy here, I think, whereby the Russians need one thing, the Chinese want to support them in one way, but not to the point of nuclear usage. but equally don't want to disrupt things too much that they're then victim of secondary sanctions and these significant tariffs and costs, which would hurt them more than even if they cut trade ties with the Russians to an extent, or whatever, altered that relationship. So no, a lot of calculations here, a lot of game theory going on, and I think it's very fascinating to sort of see how it all seeps into the broader situation with the war in Ukraine. But with the war in Ukraine, at the moment we have sort of news articles coming out that Russia's going to try and influence the Moldovians by putting 10,000 troops on their border. We obviously know how well the Kremlin is at using, should we say, influence agents. Think Tim Pool and the influences in the American, political sphere, right? So even if Russia is on the back foot, does it not still illustrate its capacity to do quite a lot with limited means? Or am I overstepping that?
I don't think it's really shown a capacity to do very much. Keep in mind, Russia's got a population of 140 million people, of which 40 million of those people don't even have indoor plumbing. In the past year and a half, 2.5 years, has lost about 600,000 soldiers or more. Another 50,000 went deserted. And what did they get in return? They have a territory that's smaller than the area of Los Angeles County, California. So any notion or fantasy that they have of one day a war with NATO countries and how they would stand up to that is a total joke. They just lost 34% of the strategic bombers to the Ukrainians who are using drones they put together themselves within Russian territory. They put the drones together. Russia does not have the capacity to wage warfare. I mean, the fact is that their senior leadership, there is nobody sitting in Moscow today that has an idea how we can win this war. How do we turn the tide? They physically have shown they don't have the capacity to change things. Russia has lost over 3,200 main battle tanks. What makes that interesting? There aren't 3,200 main battle tanks in all of the NATO armies of Europe combined. And yet they've lost that many. Russia has just showed itself to be set for defeat. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. One is the level of graft within the military, the corruption, where simply nobody's going to make a senior officer unless they've been promoting other people within the circle, or they themselves were promoted within the circle because they engaged in corruption, or they helped cover it up, or they helped to execute it. And that corruption is something that is so endemically bad within the military and the intelligence service that it's the reason that I think that this 3-day war has turned into 3.5 years. I think that the Russians, specifically Putin, really did believe this would be a 3-day war because they doled out tons and tons and tons of cash to the intelligence service to go bribe people in Ukraine and the Ukrainian military. And they were pretty sure that sure enough, the Ukrainians, all of them would just put down arms. And they were really shocked to see people did not put down arms. So what happened? What went wrong? Well, it's very clear what happened. The Russian intelligence officers had stolen the money for years and years. There's zero accountability for what happens with this money. You get millions of dollars to bribe people, and who knows if they received that money? You say, yes, they received it, and you sign a report, and it's done. And that's why I think Putin really did expect this to be a 3-day war. But there's a second aspect to this, which is that Russia itself is, despite the fact that it's, keep in mind, 140 million people, Ukraine in the free territory has about 22 million people, more or less. Let's say 22 million. So Russia is, 6 times larger of a country by population, and it has lost such a substantial amount of its military, both its might as well as its soldiers. And what can it show for it? It has got less territory today than it did in 2022. Or to phrase it differently, because Ukraine is occupying part of Russia currently, Russia has less of its own territory than it did in 2022. Russia, on no count, is winning. And Ukraine, it does definitely give up territory frequently when it sees that it's undefensible, because it has nothing to gain by defending it. And it has an objective that long-term Russia will lose and they will get back the territory. So ceding a village somewhere or another doesn't really change anything. It's better to give it up because they know that the cost and the lives of their soldiers has a high premium. And that's why Russia's strategy militarily, which is not my topic, military strategy, but why I think Russia's military strategy will fail in this case that it has worked historically successfully, is that though the Russians have always historically thrown tons and tons of troops forward, they all get machine gunned, they die, but they just keep expending more and more troops because they know that eventually they will overwhelm their opponents with the huge number of soldiers that they use. That's fun if you're destroying your enemy in the process. But in this case, the number one reason that Russian soldiers die now is drones that are used by the Ukrainians. And why that's important? Because the Russians aren't getting to a point of engagement with the Ukrainians. They're kept at a distance. The long-range weapons like HIMARS also allow that to happen. So what this all means together is that Russia's strategy of just blowing through men, it only works if you're encroaching on the Ukrainians and you're pushing them back because you're killing more of them. But if you're not successfully doing that, You're not gaining anything. This strategy worked in earlier centuries. Today, it does not work. It simply is not a successful strategy. And more than that is I think that given the economic constraints within Russia and the political tensions that exist, there are significant reasons to think that Russia will reach a point where it's no longer able to engage in warfare. And I said a very simple example, and we see that the Ukrainians are doing this successfully, is the Ukrainians understand that, as I said, militarily just fighting this war back to 1991 borders, it's not realistic. That's not how Ukraine can win. That way, Russia would eventually win because it just can keep going and going. How you change that is you change the paradigm. And what would a paradigm shift look like? What would that be? It's what they're doing now when you're attacking things within Russia. And I think if they were to attack more targets, such as the Russian Central Bank, such as the Moscow Stock Exchange, and things like this, it could greatly destabilize the Russian economy. And if you destabilize the Russian economy, at that point, for Vladimir Putin to continue this war, it becomes much more difficult, perhaps totally impossible. And so I think the implosion of the Russian economy or trying to break up the political structures within Russia, so there's persecution of the military, for instance, which would provoke a reaction from the military, that all works in Ukraine's favor. What do you think?
So no, in principle, Jason, I agree with you. I have never been one to oversell the tactical gains on the battlefield. I, like you, are not a purely military analyst, but I also don't think purely on that level. Strategically speaking, the outcome of this war will not be defined on the battlefield. It will be defined in some other form. And I think a lot of people, including yourself, really emphasize the point of the internal sort of collapse or, well, maybe spontaneous combustion of more strategic bombers as we've seen in the past 3 or 4 days. But I think the big question comes around the resilience of both sides, right? Which is more likely to falter first? A lot of people thought, it would be Ukraine because Trump comes in, he pulls all the support, the Europeans aren't able to sustain that, and therefore Russia is able to just sort of steamroll gradually over, right? Russia has that mentality to warfare or strategic patience, but in this case, it doesn't seem to be as suitable because drone warfare and highly mobile sort of FPVs and anything like that don't adhere to sort of war of attrition, slow grinding, strategic patience that the Soviets have relied on for decades, right? It doesn't work. So one wonders, therefore, can the Ukrainians tip the balance enough with the support of the Europeans? Let's leave the Americans out of it for a second. Is that enough to sustain their support to sort of overrun the Russians? And ultimately, the deciding factor is the Russian economy. That's sort of where my head is at the moment. 6 months ago, I was obviously very concerned. The Ukrainians do have losses and the Russians do make incremental gains on the battlefield. But if they can come through with these occasional huge decisive blows, we've had 2 or 3 on the Ukrainian side at this point, then that can be the tipping point. My only question is, how far can this go? Can the durability of the Russian economy outlast the ingenuity and patience or whatever willingness of the West or the Europeans to support Ukraine? Do you know what I mean?
Well, the fact is that Russia is currently expending about 40% of its national budget on national security defense related issues, and it's more than it can afford to expend. I mean, it's a lot of money they're burning on that. But there's another thing, is that it's creating a lot of inflation within Russia. So it's something that I think runs a different risk for them. But let's look at a different issue totally, which is the fact that can Russia continue like this for long or forever? It certainly can't continue like this for long or forever. And once again, Vladimir Putin's objectives at the end of the day, much more than he even cares about Ukraine, is his own survivability. I think that's his top priority, like it is for all dictators. So the day that he realizes that perhaps this is running too much of a risk for myself, or my regime, then I think his attitude will change. Now, some people say, but after, what would happen then? How would that go down? A lot of different ways it could go down. I mean, he could just declare victory whenever he wants and go back to Russia. But a different way that this could happen, I think, is that if you're somebody, and why I think that Putin is actually at high risk in his own life of ending at some point in the near future, is simply that Vladimir Putin is 72 years old. He is somebody who everybody knows is the center of all the power in Russia. And if you're an oligarch, let's say from the military, you're tied to the military, you're not tied to the intelligence services, you realize that after Putin, somebody's going to take power. And whoever comes to power is going to squash all those who are part of rival factions. And there's tons of rival factions in the inner elites of the Russians within the Kremlin. And if you know that the rival factions can come to power and go after you and persecute you and your family and liquidate you all and take your assets, then why would you sit around and wait for that to happen? You wait for one day for Putin to die and this is going to occur? The smarter thing to do, in game theory would argue the best thing you could do, is be the one to take Putin's life yourself. That way you can create your own fate. And if you're able to create a coalition of people that you need within the military or the intelligence services, that's how coups take place. I mean, to be successful in a coup, you need, overthrowing the government, you need to have either the military intelligence service to buy in. When you have both of them, it's even better. But in the case of Russia, it's unrealistic. But let's say, imagine you get them to buy in. What would happen then? Well, no matter who takes power after Putin, and I think it's most likely the people I would guess, even if they were to overthrow power, I think are not as much of a risk to global peace as is Putin for several reasons. But amongst those top reasons is that the most dangerous part of any coup or revolution is the post-revolutionary phase, the immediate phase, right after the overthrow of power, and you've decided that you are the new leader of the country. You've decided to insert yourself. Why is that? Because everyone says, what makes you the legitimate leader? I want to become the leader. Who gave you that power? And then people are going to sit there and try to push you out of power. The way that they do that is probably using force. So what do you do? Well, why would you possibly keep your troops down somewhere in Ukraine, which doesn't really matter in the grand scheme, when you can have those troops in Moscow protecting you and your new regime? That's obviously the much higher priority. Because once again, if I've just taken power, that's what I need to do is secure my own survivability. But there's a second aspect of this, which is to keep survivability after you overthrow a government. It's important to gain some sort of legitimacy. And the way you gain legitimacy is domestic, but it's also international. You need to be recognized internationally. And I think the international community wouldn't recognize somebody who, well, one, didn't have control of the nuclear arsenal of Russia. That would be key. But second to that would be that they would pull out of Ukraine because otherwise it's just better to allow the power struggle to continue within Russia. So I think the West would be firm on that. And I think that whoever comes to power would be smart enough to know that he needs to consolidate power. And the way he does that is by bringing the troops from Ukraine back to Moscow to protect the new government. But what do you think?
Well, I think that it surprises me when you say that there are people who are, Putin's not the worst, but I think of Vladimir Zhirinovsky, right? He passed away soon after the full-scale invasion in 2022. Vladimir Zhirinovsky was the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is nothing like the name says. It's ultra-nationalist, and he was actually, if anything, more extreme than Putin. This is not a defense of Putin, but it shows you that there are people worse than him that are in the Russian or whatever Kremlin system. So it interests me that you say that, but certainly as we've seen in post-war, post-conflict scenarios, right? Look at Syria. In the past 6 months, we've had a very unconventional, to say the least. And, I don't know how I feel about the current leader of the country, but, it's not following what we expected, right? A former associate of Al-Qaeda is actually doing quite good things for the country. We were worried it become a new hotbed of jihadist extremism. So these things can be incredibly unpredictable, but in essence, if Putin is out of the picture, then suddenly you get a Russia which is completely unpredictable. We have no idea what happens. And it always makes me think of that film with Nicole Kidman and George Clooney, Peacemaker, right? Where you've got these sorts of separatists, ultra-nationalists, whatever, people from Chechnya or Dagestan, and they get themselves hands on a weapon, on a nuclear warhead. And sort of, at least with Putin, that he's not going to do any of that. At least we think, right? But the further these things go further down the line, it makes you begin to reconsider what may well be his red line. But as we've already discussed, the Chinese, the Indians would not have that. So we like to believe that that's enough of a deterrent for Putin not to go that far.
Second to that, when we talk about people such as, they really are, but we look at like Zhirinovsky or Dmitry Medvedev, who made a lot of statements that are really sort of extreme, over the top. Medvedev has always talked about nuclear warfare in World War III. And I made a video for my YouTube channel about this recently, is that he's playing a role. It's all part of, it's a system. Everything within Russia is a system. And that's why you don't see Peskov, who's a spokesman for Putin, making statements like that. But you see these different people who routinely make statements like this, like Solovey, who's a propagandist, and others. But neither here nor there, I think there's another aspect of this, which is, okay, let's imagine that we cross all the red lines and Putin uses a nuclear weapon. At that stage, what would you expect to happen? Does he expect that then the Ukrainians will stop fighting? That's not going to happen. Rather, that probably coalesce support around Ukraine's cause from others who then realize that the Putin regime is not stable and we don't necessarily need it to continue anymore. Because the whole problem was that for 3 years during the Biden administration, there was always this fear from Jake Sullivan specifically of escalation and this could start a nuclear war. But guess what? If you take away that fear and you're no longer worried about it, or you've actually proven that, yep, you're nuts, he's going to use nukes, at that stage, what is the motivation to keep you in power? Because now you are a threat to global security and you should be removed. So I see no way that this works out well for Putin.
No, it certainly doesn't work out for Putin. And it's one of these things, Russia escalates to de-escalate, classic nuclear doctrine there. But, it's always one of those things. You don't want to play too much with the fire, right? And I think there are huge inconsistencies in the West, right? Some countries want to have a relationship with Russia of some form. Others are more bullish or hawkish. The Baltic states, the UK are more, antagonistic historically. And I think it's this inconsistency also that plays into the hands of the Kremlin, because they're like, well, we can exploit that. We can exploit that through our own indirect influences, through influencer agencies or whatever we've done, through money, whatever, in the past. So it's all these considerations that I think we have to keep in mind when we're talking about these things. But I guess my last question for you, Jason, with all that in mind, is what would you encourage people to look out for in the next, let alone months or weeks, just days?
There's a couple of different things I think are of particular interest, but I personally am watching very carefully the Russian economy. I think the signs that we see coming out of that, even though the government has classified a lot of economic data, it's no longer public, the things that are coming out and they do publicize, the central bank, it's pretty shocking. It's pretty bad. But more than that, I think that the attacks within Russia itself, once again, Ukraine just blew up these strategic bombers. That was big. But imagine that tomorrow Ukraine decided to make a priority of hitting the Moscow Stock Exchange every single day with drones. That could seriously destabilize the stock market. How if they're hitting the central bank or the treasury? It would have a similar effect. These sorts of things are things that I think could change the war and be a paradigm shift. And the reason is simple, is that Vladimir Putin ultimately will serve his own interest first and foremost. And if he thinks that something is reaching the point of destabilizing his regime, I think that he would probably take action to stabilize it, because that is his greatest priority.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave it there for now, everyone. Jason J. Smart, of the Kiev Post and prominent YouTuber as well now. Great to have you back, as always. And I'm sure we will do this again very soon, but perhaps under more positive circumstances. Take care, everyone.